We have here the money man, Gary Sasse, former director of administration, head of RIPEC, head of the Hassenfeld Institute, you name it, he's led it. And we are talking about, we're going to start off with a little Paw Sox discussion. Okay. Last week was the Senate hearing, 5 hours or so, 4 or 5 hours of hearings. Miraculously, the first 4,000 to testify were all in favor of it. The appearance was somewhat of this looking a little bit slanted. What's your take on how just the fundamentals of the hearing process and where we are on the Paw Sox funding scheme?
Well, the hearing process itself did not do the proponents any favor. You know, at best it was a dog and pony show. At worst, it was intimidation. Normally the way these hearings are conducted is the committee will hear somebody pro and somebody con, because the objective is to get information to the committee and to let them in real time understand both sides. And that way you can ask questions better, you can ask questions of a subsequent witness from one side or the other. And the way it was conducted, you know, the opponents didn't get a chance to speak until 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Now the argument was, well, they just signed up late. Well, I've been around for a long time. They may have signed up later, but there are all kinds of ways to do that. And so it was a bad process. I'm probably one of the few people in the state that legitimately have not made up my mind about this project, but when I see the interest groups using that kind of tactic, when I see the interest groups not seemingly interested in having a good, objective debate, regardless of what side you come down on.
Yeah, absolutely.
But having a debate, because you know the best thing that could happen from the view of the pro-Paw Sox people is for the Assembly to pass a bill that dots all the I's and crosses all the T's, not just a bill that was presented. So I found the process to be, before the legislature, very discouraging.
Listen, about probably, if you haven't read the bill and read the Finance Committee staff's PowerPoint presentation, it is a complex funding structure. This is, yeah, and things are interdependent on one another, and where the risk is in question, and a bunch of other issues. I'll bet you 99.9% of Rhode Islanders have no idea what the structure of the financing, and how would they? The process just began. So I tend to agree with you. I think from us covering that event, we were disappointed that there wasn't a more balanced presentation on the facts. You know, we had an article today about 2 U.S. senators, one of them, Cory Booker, who's a likely candidate on the Democratic side for President of the United States in 2020, and a classmate of Governor Raimondo, and a very close friend of Governor Raimondo. Stephen Pryor, the head of commerce, worked for Cory Booker when he was mayor of Newark, has a piece of legislation at the federal level that would functionally kill this financial structure, because it would take away the tax-free element of municipal bonds for the use of a sports stadium. Mm-hmm. You know, as a matter of public policy, what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's a good idea. I think that's an example of a totally unnecessary loophole. Now, I don't blame the current ownership for trying to take advantage of that loophole.
Sure.
And I think any legislation that passes will be subsequent to decisions made here. So I don't think it'll have an impact here, but in terms of public policy of closing these tax loopholes that favor wealthy investors, is probably a good idea.
It was interesting when they released the legislation in the United States Senate. They cited 20 different academic analyses over the years that all came to the same conclusion, according to 40.
Yes.
You're asserting 40.
Yes.
And the 40 come to the same conclusion, which is in the public financing of sports stadium, in the analysis after the fact, that there is no discernible positive economic impact to those communities.
Right. There were a couple of professors that looked at peer research on the economics of stadium development, and in 40 of those studies, they couldn't find a positive correlation.
That was the Brookings analysis.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is interesting. We call Brookings down here to develop a.
We spent $1.5 million with Brookings.
Yeah, help develop our strategic plan. The Rhode Island Foundation and others were very involved in it.
Right.
But now Brookings is not right.
Well, you pay for, right? You get the report, you pay for. We've got a number of financial issues, obviously. The budget deficit in the state of Rhode Island is now being flagged for this fiscal year, $237 million. The governor, I think, put together a study of the infrastructure of schools and found that there's a unfunded need of about $2.2 billion, but $620 million of really critical, immediate need, very significant need, dangerous situations, things like that. We're talking about roughly $38 million in public financing to support the Pawtucket Red Sox. Your thought on that in relationship to these other needs and demands on a very limited fiscal bucket?
Well, if you spend $1 in one place, then there are opportunity costs somewhere else. So if we spend $1 for debt service on a stadium, that's $1 we don't have to spend on education or on roads or on some other area. But when you look at a $9 billion budget and you're looking at debt service of $1.5 million to $2 million a year, you need to put that in perspective as well. But there are other serious financial concerns about the project. I think it's Article 6, Section 11 of the Rhode Island Constitution says, and it's very clear, that you need a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly on any spending bill where private money, i.e. taxpayer money, is used for private or local purpose. And I can't remember a budget being passed in the state of Rhode Island that didn't have a 2/3 vote.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at this deal that Poor Sox are talking about, I think the 2/3 vote applies. The Providence, not Providence, but the Pawtucket Redevelopment Authority is a local entity.
Yeah.
It's a local entity that's been given state funds to pay debt service. And the law is, there's also a court opinion that says if a quasi-public agency uses debt and then turns around and leases the property that was built as a result of that debt, that article of the Constitution also applies. So this hasn't been discussed, it's flying under the radar, but the political dynamics could change significantly if a 2/3 vote is required. And I think out of an abundance of caution, we need to get a clarified answer to that, because I feel reasonably certain that if this passes without a 2/3 majority, it will invite future litigation and future confusion. And so those are some of the, I'm getting in the weeds a little bit, but
well, that's a pretty big issue.
That's an important issue. The other issue, you talked about debt. We have a lot of debt. We have a lot of unmet needs. We have a big deficit. But I wouldn't confuse an operating budget with a capital budget.
Sure.
Totally. But there's another issue. What we should have learned from 38 Studios is that moral obligation bonds are really an obligation of the taxpayer. Moody's, Standard & Poor's will just whip you into submission if you say it's a moral, not a legal obligation. And the way you get around moral obligation bonds, which I am very much opposed to ever using a moral obligation bond, is to go to the voters, have a general obligation bond approved. That way the people give thumbs up or thumbs down to the project. But also from a financial perspective, when you talk about tight dollars and trying to operate as economically as possible, general obligation bonds, which you could sell as opposed to moral obligation bonds, carry a lot lower interest rates. So the cost, the out-year cost, would be significantly lower. And I don't understand why the legislature, in their wisdom, wouldn't subject this to a vote of the people so they could save a hell of a lot of money on interest payments.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of issues that I look at. I look at the issue of, and I don't have answers to these questions yet, that's why I have no position. I look at the issue of how good are the revenue and attendance assumptions. And I find out that, I think it was 2016, attendance at McCoy was about 420,000. The projected attendance for the first year in a new stadium is increased by 40%. It's increased to almost 600,000. That's high compared to experience in other places, because there is an increase in attendance.
Yeah, we looked at a few months ago the other new stadiums in the International League, and what would happen is, when the new park was built or significant rehab, $30 million or more, there'd be a slight increase in attendance to a significant increase in attendance in the short term, but it wasn't sustained.
But also, what I looked at, questioned whether it was 20 or 25 or 30%. I haven't seen a 40% increase. Now,
No.
that may have been the case, and then the drop is only 5%. The drop is normally maybe 10%. So, but I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think there are questions that I think the legislature needs to clarify about how good the assumptions are, then the assumptions on revenues will generate. I think, if my memory serves me correct, they've estimated that this facility will generate more revenues, greater dollars, than would have been the case if the ballpark was built in Providence.
Right.
So there are all these kinds of questions floating out there of the political.
And that seems unlikely. I mean, you know.
But the assumptions, the question you raised earlier today about, what, do they have an economist? Well, they bought an economist, anybody, that could show that the public subsidy has a return on investment, or if not a return on investment, because it's not a loss on investment. The question of the assumptions, the question of what's politically required to get this passed, the question, are we using the most efficient debt financing mechanisms? And no one's even asked the question about the environmental facilities.
There's there's a lawsuit pending right now in Superior Court, a battle between the former owners and the previous over about a $6 million alleged cleanup cost.
Okay, so but if the Providence, Pawtucket Redevelopment Authority takes this over, the owner of the land is liable for the remuneration.
Correct.
Course. Well, that may be reasonable, it may not be reasonable, but where's that built into the budget?
It is not present.
So you go through all of those kinds of questions, and you don't have to be an opponent or a proponent of the project to say, regardless of how the legislature comes out on this thing, you want a good project.
Right.
And so the kind of questions that we are discussing are things that the legislature, if in their wisdom they want to approve this project, needs to think about now so they're not surprised in the future.
Listen, I think, the vast majority of Rhode Islanders would like to see the Pawtucket Red Sox remain in Rhode Island. It also appears that there is not another viable option for them. The state of Massachusetts has said they're not going to provide public financing to move to attract the stadium, attract the team over. So a little bit of good public policy might be, and we've editorialized about it, build the roads, which is historical, maybe acquire the land, determine about the environmental costs, what the state's role is in that. But, deep concerns about building state stadiums for private entities of significant means to be able to operate their private business.
A little bit of an aside on that. So the governor comes out with her economic development program, and she and Commerce RI say they have to use subsidies because other states use subsidies, you have to compete. But other states are not using subsidies here, so
No.
Explain the logic.
Right.
The logic gets kind of confusing.
It does.
This is country people,
Yeah.
But,
We've Go Local in Worcester. There's clearly an interest in Worcester of getting the Pawtucket Red Sox to move there. There is no proposal on the table in 2 years for any subsidy of any kind. So we've been bidding against ourselves to our own detriment.
But on the other side, let me be the devil for a second. What the legislature needs to do is to really do their due diligence and say this is a good deal, it's not a good deal, or it's a mediocre deal. They need to do their due diligence and say to make this deal work, even though this wasn't negotiated, this is what has to be included. And so, if you get somebody who's in a position of not knowing, whether we should not do it, then the question becomes, is it a good deal? What are the risks? And it takes a certain kind of due diligence, not a political pandering to interest groups.
Right. Let's talk about the deficit. Jump over from the Paw Sox, which obviously have some relationship, whether it's long-term debt or this next year's budget. Where are we? Is there reasons to be concerned? The economy's doing pretty well at a national level. Its unemployment remains fairly low in Rhode Island, with some bumps with Alexion and Benny's hiccuping. But where are we, and what should folks know about the budget situation?
Well, it's very disturbing because, as you point out, we're almost to full employment, and yet our deficit keeps on growing. I like to look at it and put it in historical perspective. So when the governor submitted her first budget, she was projecting a deficit for fiscal 19. And fiscal 19 is the year that starts July of 2018 and runs through June of 2019. So that was 2 years out.
Yeah.
And she was projecting, her budget projected a deficit of about $234 million. The budget that she most recently submitted projected a deficit of $151 million in fiscal year 19, which would have been a notable achievement because that would have been reducing a structural deficit by about 35%. And then all of a sudden we find out, no, it's not, we're not going to make an achievement in dealing with our structural deficit. As a matter of fact, we're going in the other direction. And the deficit will be slightly larger than it was projected 2 years ago. And it's slightly larger, and it's a cause of concern. On the positive side, the economy can always get better. They can engender more fiscal discipline. On the other side, there are tremendous concerns and tremendous risks to the forecast that you hit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can't even come up with a good projection of what our human service spending is. The fact that revenues declined in a good time means that we overestimated them, particularly with sales tax, income tax, and business taxes, and that you don't catch up for, that overestimating. We're also finding that no one is really taking fiscal responsibility seriously. If you look at the out-year forecast, spending is projected to grow by about 11 or 12%, revenues by 8%. That's unsustainable.
Right.
And then you've got the uncertainty of what's going to happen in Washington. Changes in the tax code can affect the state. Changes, we're going flying the flag.
So the next revenue conference is
It's
November. And if that comes back and flags, let's say the 237 jumps up to 300 million, which some are anticipating.
Well, I wouldn't make it, then it's serious now. That becomes an extremely serious problem. And it really raises questions about the financial stewardship of the state at that point, something like that happened. So I'm not pessimistic or optimistic. I know there are a couple of things that happened that make it much more difficult to solve. I mentioned a few of them a minute ago. But also, the budget that was adopted for the current fiscal year was all gimmicked up. It had a structural budget deficit of almost $50 million. Current spending exceeded current revenue by $50 million. It identified 25 million of unidentified flying savings, to put it. It had about at least 50 million of one-time revenues that you have to find other one-time sources or to close it. So we played a lot of our cards, and the situation continued to deteriorate. The other thing that needs to be thought about is what is the human capacity of people in state government, working, very hard to cope with this problem, because they are tired out. They have been working on closing deficits for a decade now.
Yeah. And
you think you're making some progress, and all of a sudden you're back to where you were 2 years ago. There's a capacity issue that you have to manage, and which I'm not sure is being managed very effectively.
Are we just missing? Missing on our understanding of our own state's economy?
We're missing on. I had an old professor. He basically said, "Don't worry about taxes, worry about spending, and taxes will take care of themselves."
Yeah.
I think that's 80% true, but there's some truth to it. And one number I keep on focusing at: if you're constantly having a 5-year projection of out-year spending, and constantly every year your projection of spending exceeds your projection of revenue, then you can never catch up. And that's what's been happening. And so it gets back to the question, something you were discussing earlier today, of making choices. We can do, legislation, the governor can do anything they want to do, but they can't do everything. And the message has not gotten back that there are certain things that we just can't afford to be doing. Now, that's a political decision. Waste of time, you and I say it's here, it's here, it's here, but there needs to be more fiscal, needs to be the political will. The other issue, and this ties back the budget to economics, you go to the average relocation firm or the average corporation that we want to attract to the state. Let me say, the first question, good schools, competitive taxes,
No.
State government that's innovative, and a state government that's fiscally stable. You tell me, and fiscally stable being the most important one of those four factors, you tell me that you meet those four factors, I don't give a squat about what Commerce Rhode Island's doing.
Well, listen, we just saw it a week ago. Alexian announced they're cutting 250 jobs and closing their facility in Rhode Island. Equally important, they announced that they were going to move their corporate headquarters from New Haven, another state that's having some fiscal management issues, and they are moving their headquarters to Boston.
Yeah.
And what's Boston? Boston checks off all four of those.
Except that, each case is different, and you have to look at the situation in each case. And I think there's a different Alexian. Alexian's a corporate basket case.
Yep.
So you can't, pin
But
that.
it's there's 900 jobs from Amazon up there recently with no subsidy. Obviously, GE, how that will play out, we'll see.
But I think the point when you start to, just as we criticize the state for picking winners, we have to be careful how we pick losers, how we focus on losers, because Alexion's a corporate basket case.
Yeah.
Benny was caught up in a family situation and the changing in
Generations.
Retail trade. That didn't result from bad state
Yep.
policy. But on the other hand, the inability to.
Well, isn't it interesting, Mr. Bromberg was on last week, I think in your absence, filling in for you.
I was here last week.
Oh, you were here? No, you weren't.
Actually, I was. I know where I'm at.
Oh, you were here. And his comment was the stagnation of population.
Oh, that's the biggest one.
Yeah. He said 50 years ago they had whatever it was, 10 stores. Now they have 30 stores, the same number of people.
The one of the key elements which we don't talk enough about, he couldn't be more precise and correct in what he said. If your population is not growing, your economy is not growing. The correlation is almost direct. And so our population stays at 1,050,000. It doesn't change very much. And then when you couple that with the lack of effective programs to develop mid-skill level jobs,
Right.
and a stagnant population tends to become grayer or younger. Your workforce participation goes down. People, and from the point of view of Ben's or any kind of retailer, people with an extra dollar in their pocket are not here. They're old people with no fixed income or kids. And then you look at the demographics of the population and the socioeconomic status of people who are moving out versus people who are moving in. It's really a challenge for the state. And so you sit back and you ask yourself the question, well, how do we meet that challenge? Well, I'll tell you one way you don't meet the challenge. You don't meet the challenge by taking $135 million and giving it out to people who build office buildings and hotels. You take that $135 million and you invest in things that will stabilize the middle class, will cause growth. A stable middle class population, age-bearing, people actively engaged, and that's where we're missing it.
Last question. You're either director of administration or governor. Would you go all in on trying to recruit Amazon?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I wouldn't hesitate for a second.
It's interesting. Governor, that day that it was announced that she was motivated and focused on it, and despite literally dozens of requests for information over there relating to what's the state's response, we've heard nothing back after about a week or so.
But you have to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Yeah.
And just as I answered the question, I would go all in on it. I would certainly have an administration that didn't have my human service information system, collapsing. I would have an administration that was doing something about failing schools. I would have,
Maybe the solution is to turn over UHIP and our school system to Jeff Bezos, and we'd be better off. Listen, I want to thank you.
Pleasure, good to see you.
Good to see you as always.